So we've discussed the possibilities of ancient technology, mostly in the context of employing acoustic vibrations in the moving, cutting, and carving of huge stones. However, like today, technology and technological concepts usually expand to cover many different aspects of life. If the ancients did possess technology significantly more advanced than they are typically given credit for, then did this ancient progressiveness also lead to different ways to generate light? In addition to building up grand structures towards the sky, ancient builders were equally adept at digging extensive tunnels, underground chambers, and underground structures. To accomplish similar tasks today, we have a myriad of electric lighting options to choose from in order to light up the dark. But what did the ancients use? How were they able to adequately see in the dark in order to complete such detailed and intricate work? In some cases, the inner chambers were built first so that they could be completed in daylight, while the rest of the structure was then built over it. But it is highly doubtful that the same procedure was used to create all concealed spaces. And even after the construction and consecration was complete, how did they see inside of these structures, which were then shut off from direct sunlight? We know that the ancients used large torches and oil lamps, but would they always be the most practical? To generate a large amount of light, a large number of torches and or oil lamps would be needed, which in turn would not only produce smoke and soot, depending on which fuel was used, but they would also consume vital oxygen, with carbon dioxide and monoxide as toxic byproducts. This would be especially problematic in very deep chambers and long tunnels, as access to fresh air becomes increasingly limited the deeper and further underground. In addition to this, investigators have not found substantial soot or carbon residue on the surfaces of some of the temple walls and ceilings. There could be a few reasons for this. One is that the ancients, in using torches and oil lamps for an extended period of time, would have become experts in greatly reducing their residues within confined spaces. It is cited here that the addition of salt to torches minimizes lamp black or soot pigment. Fuel choice also has an impact on smoke production. For instance, the Egyptians are known to have sometimes used castor oil and animal fats in their oil lamps instead of olive and other plant oils. Highly saturated plant and animal fats such as coconut oil and ghee, respectively, are known to produce substantially less soot than other fuels such as vegetable oils and fossil fuels. Of the soot that has been found, it has been noted that in some cases, the residue does not date to ancient times, but rather more recent investigations and even lootings. It has also been noted that some of the residue in some of the more popular destinations has simply been removed via extensive archaeological restoration and cleaning. Some alternative theorists have even suggested ancient electric lighting as a possible solution to this mystery. Ultimately, even with little soot, combustible fuels, regardless of makeup, still consume oxygen as they burn and produce carbon dioxide and monoxide as byproducts. So it would not be unlikely that ancient civilizations would have attempted to develop other sources of on-demand lighting, in addition to using traditional sources such as torches, oil lamps, and candles, just as we do today. There are indeed other ways to generate light than via familiar electrical systems or combustible fuels. Bioluminescence is one of the ways of achieving this. Bioluminescence is light produced by chemical reactions within living organisms, a type of chemiluminescence. These types of chemical reactions are unique in that they emit cold light. This means that less than 20% of the light generates thermal radiation or heat. Most bioluminescent organisms are found in the ocean and include bioluminescent marine species such as fish, bacteria, and jellies. Bioluminescent organisms more familiar to us include fireflies and perhaps glowworms and some beetles. There are also certain fungi that exhibit these properties, but almost no bioluminescent organisms are native to freshwater habitats. Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, harnessing bioluminescence for practical lighting is actually not a new concept. Before the development of the safety lamp for use in coal mines, dried fish skins were used in Britain and in Europe as a weak source of light. This experimental form of illumination avoided the necessity of using candles, which risked sparking explosions of fire damp, not to mention soot and other carbon byproducts. But dried fish, as we can imagine, gave off a horrible odor as large amounts of them were needed to phosphoresce. Another safer and probably stronger source of illumination in mines were bottles containing fireflies. And so we can see that bioluminescence has even been employed in more recent times as a source of artificial light before the commercialization of electric lighting. Hence, we can reasonably assume that it could have been a source of practical lighting in ancient times as well. The ancient Greeks were aware of bioluminescence as far back as 500 BC, with Aristotle making one of the first known systematic studies of the phenomenon in the 300s BC. And so it is certainly likely that earlier cultures, such as the Egyptians, were also aware of bioluminescence and perhaps even made practical use of it. The orb here is filled with natural marine microalgae or plankton known as dinoflagellates or Pyrocystis fusiformis, a non-toxic bioluminescent species, also known commercially as pyrodinos. There are single-celled sea plants which grow via photosynthesis and are essentially biological solar cells, which can store light energy by day and release that energy at night in the form of visible light. As we can see, they can be easily placed inside of a transparent orb filled with a nutritious liquid. As the pyrodinos are plankton, they don't move or luminesce much on their own. Being drifters, they are generally carried along by tides and currents in the ocean. Thus, motion, such as swirling, causes them to fluoresce. Gentle mechanical oscillation or musical vibration can make them light up as well. They can be cultivated and will reproduce indefinitely. Hence, we can imagine how cultivating them in great densities could enable biolights of great luminosity to be produced. One caveat is that they usually will only generate light at night, as they have their own natural cycle, and will generally not illuminate during the day, even in a dark space, even though it may be possible to modify this cycle. So perhaps at the least, we could imagine the ancients lighting their dark spaces with mirror systems, oil lamps, and perhaps even triboluminescence during the day, and bioluminescence at night. The Egyptians were producing glass as early as about 1500 BC, and the Mesopotamians perhaps a millennium earlier. So it seems reasonable that they could have created bioluminescent orbs. They would only need a method of keeping the organisms agitated within their fluid. This could be done by hand, but having a mechanized system would be more desirable. And as we'll discuss a little later, it might even be possible to use very low voltage electric current to activate them in a type of electrobioluminescence. Similar types of ultra-low power applications are partly where we are headed with some of today's technology, with increasingly miniaturized circuits, LEDs, and cell phones. Power sources for such devices would include our own bodily motions, geoelectricity from earth batteries, and even atmospheric electricity. Could it be possible that ancient civilizations were experts in practical, low-power energy harvesting thousands of years ago? As just briefly mentioned, harnessing the triboluminescent properties of natural materials is another potential way of generating artificial light without electricity or combustion. Triboluminescence is defined as the emission of light from substances caused by rubbing, scratching, or other frictional contact. Examples include light emission produced when crushing sugar or rubbing pieces of quartz together. The property is not completely understood, but is believed to occur via the ionization of the nitrogen in the air. This in turn produces invisible ultraviolet light, but certain materials can absorb this ultraviolet radiation and then re-emit the energy in the visible range. But is it possible to use this property for practical lighting? Interestingly, there is at least one account of triboluminescence being used to generate non-electrical light in the past. It says here that the indigenous Ute people from central Colorado used this property to create light during ceremonies with special rattles. Made from buffalo hide filled with clear crystals collected from the mountains, the rattles would be vigorously shaken at night during the ceremonies, generating flashes of visible light through the translucent buffalo hide membranes. Another interesting fact is that the Ute are descendants of the Aztec Empire, an empire which flourished in central Mexico from approximately AD 1325 to 1521, and was the builder of the Great Pyramid of Cholula, a pyramid with a base 4 times larger and a volume 2 times greater than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Is it possible that the triboluminescence principles realized in the buffalo rattles are technological remnants of the Aztec civilization, the Ute's ancestors? Many factors must be present and come together to form high civilizations. Ideas and knowledge that is otherwise scattered far and wide are occasionally brought together in a common space, and when that happens, these ideas and concepts can feed off of each other and increase almost exponentially, becoming more complex and developed within a relatively short period of time. But its complexity can also lead to an equally quick downfall. When a system has many factors which rely on each other, it becomes more vulnerable to degradation if one or more of these factors begin to fail, as we've seen with just about all previous great civilizations on Earth. And when these civilizations fall, their technology, cultures, and knowledge are scattered just as their people are, later re-emerging elsewhere, but often not in their fully developed iterations. And so when we look at the property of triboluminescence and its use by the Ute, we might wonder if cultures older than the Ute and even more ancient than their ancestors, the Aztecs, may have also harnessed it in similar ways. Triboluminescence is but one of several types of mechanoluminescence. There's also fractoluminescence, which is light released by fracture stress, piezoluminescence caused by pressure, and the more familiar sonoluminescence, which emerges in liquids when exposed to certain frequencies and amplitudes of sound. It is currently unknown as to whether or not ancient peoples made practical, large-scale use of mechanoluminescence. But being keenly observant and innovative, it is certainly likely that they knew of the property just as the Ute, and therefore may have found ways to exploit it in an even more significant way. If not for general societal purposes, then perhaps during very large special ceremonies, both religious or otherwise. The ancients certainly held crystals in high regard. The Egyptians, for instance, had high esteem for rose quartz in particular, believing it to have magical properties, from warding off the effects of wrinkles and aging to even harnessing the power of the heavens. Could generating light have also been one of its magical properties? And if so, then was the luminescent properties of quartz utilized by not only the Aztecs, but also the Egyptians, the Greeks and the Nubians and other ancient cultures? If the Egyptians harnessed triboluminescence by rubbing rose quartz or other crystals together, they may have developed better ways to produce the light than by hand. Perhaps an innovative variation of their core driller could have been used for this purpose. The bold driller would allow far greater rubbing pressure to be developed than could be developed by hand due to the enhanced leverage, hence greatly enhancing efficiency and reducing muscle fatigue. So mechanoluminescence may have also been a possible source of ancient lighting. But like today, it is very possible that they did not use only one type of light, as even in modern times, we still make use of oil lamps and candles in addition to fluorescent bulbs and LEDs. We certainly know that the Egyptians used polished surfaces as mirrors to direct light from the sun, and perhaps even torches at night into tunnels and chambers. However, light generally loses intensity every time it is reflected, depending on the reflection angle. This could be problematic, as the number of needed mirrors would increase the further underground and the greater the distance from the source. But as a curious side note, it has been discovered that the Egyptians created one of the world's first synthetic pigments called Egyptian blue. This pigment was skillfully created by heating copper, sand, lime, and alkali together. But what's very unusual about this pigment is its luminescence, but infrared luminescence rather than visible luminescence. Egyptian blue was routinely used to paint ancient depictions of gods and royalty, but it has been found that it can also be used to cool rooftops and walls. It apparently absorbs visible light and then re-emits the energy in the infrared spectrum. Art historians have used this unique fluorescence to distinguish Egyptian blue from other similar pigments, enabling them to reconstruct the history of ancient art. This amazing substance has also been found to have a number of modern applications, which include solar generation of electricity via windows. Of course, it is widely believed that the Egyptians, as ancient peoples, were unaware of infrared radiation as we understand it today. But curiously, it has been recently discovered that the Great Pyramid has unusual electromagnetic properties. It says here that scientists calculated that wavelengths between 200 and 600 meters would include resonance within the pyramid, a situation where the structure scatters and absorbs much more energy from magnetic waves than in ordinary conditions. By using computer modeling, they worked out how the radio wave energy would be scattered and absorbed in the resonant state. They found that the structure appears to focus electromagnetic energy in its internal chambers as well as under its base. It is further stated that these findings could have a variety of implications. The results can apply to the design of nanoparticles capable of reproducing similar focusing effects in the optical range. Such nanoparticles can be used as the building blocks for constructions of different optical devices for management of light energy at the nanoscale. But the article notes that it is highly unlikely that the ancient Egyptians knew anything about this. And so the question is, how likely is it that the Egyptians could create two products, the pyramids and the pigmentation, both with electromagnetic properties, without any concept of electromagnetism? It is certainly not impossible that this is a coincidence, but it does beg the question. We should also acknowledge that the Egyptians did have at least a basic working knowledge of electricity, as they used high voltage from small electric catfish as electroshock therapy to treat arthritic pain in patients, as well as migraines, melancholy, and epilepsy. They depicted this fish as far back as 3100 BC on the Narmer palette. Larger Nile catfish can even generate up to 400 volts. Knowing that the Egyptians experimented and that their technology was ever evolving, is it possible that they found other ways to generate electricity, as well as find new applications for it? And if so, then it is also possible that they had at least a working knowledge of electromagnetism. It is yet another intriguing mystery of the ancient world. Mysteries which keep coming. It might not be surprising then if it were eventually found that ancient peoples created similar pigments that absorb heat and visible light during the day, and then re-emitted that energy as visible light at night, either through chemiluminescence or bioluminescence. And speaking again on bioluminescence, it is known that the nighttime Navy operations, swimmers, and underwater vehicles are vulnerable to detection due to their agitation of phytoplanktons and other sea creatures. Studies have found that certain alternating current, or AC electric and magnetic field magnitudes and frequencies, could mitigate or suppress bioluminescence by affecting the intracellular calcium ion concentrations or reducing the enzymes critical to light production. In studies within the frequency bandwidth of 60 Hz to 20 kHz, it was found that bioluminescent substances subjected to the higher 15 to 20 kHz frequency band were sufficiently mitigated, while the lower frequency band of 60 to 5 kHz tended to stimulate photon emissions, enabling and perhaps even enhancing bioluminescence. So it might be reasonable to assume that lower frequency AC or even DC currents may have a similar enhancing effect. Such effects will make possible a property of chemiluminescence or electrobioluminescence, in which the level of emitted light could be artificially influenced by low-level electrical currents. There are a few modern startup companies who are looking to develop entire systems of bioluminescent lighting for widespread practical use. GlowWe is one such company which wants to take the bacteria that's found on squids and use them to light up entire cities, generating light that is cheaper than electrical lighting from both an economic and environmental cost perspective. GlowWe's mission statement highlights its isolation of the genetic coding that creates bioluminescence. Inserting this code into common non-toxic and non-pathogenic bacteria, clean, safe, and synthetic bioluminescence can be created. Once engineered and grown, the bacteria are encapsulated into transparent shells alongside a media composed of the nutrients that they need to live and make light. This lighting solution can grow indefinitely and exponentially with little infrastructure and little extraction of natural resources. Another innovator named Teresa van Dongen, a Dutch designer, has invented the ambio light, a brass lighting fixture whose light source is bioluminescent bacteria that is found on octopus tentacles. When exposed to oxygen, these microorganisms emit a soft blue hue that glows like an organic nightlight. These bacteria can glow for long periods of time as long as they are exposed to sufficient oxygen and gentle motion. Again, it makes us wonder if ancient civilizations may have accomplished something very similar. When speaking of artificial lighting in the ancient world, though, the first thing that comes to mind for some alternative theorists is the alleged Dendera light motif that is found in the Egyptian Hathor temple, seeing it as a form of early electrical lighting. But could bioluminescence allow us to see the Dendera motif in a different light? Pardon the pun. Mainstream Egyptologists explain the motif as depicting the Egyptian creation myth. The temple contains several reliefs depicting Harsomtes, a variation of the Egyptian god Horus, in the form of a snake emerging from a lotus flower. The Dendera light is a variation of this motif, showing Harsomtes in an oval container, which might represent the womb of Nut or Nut, the Egyptian sky goddess. But some alternative theorists have theorized that the motif looks remarkably like a large light bulb or a Crookes tube, complete with attached power cable. The Crookes tube being an early experimental electrical discharge tube. Invented by English physicist William Crookes, a partial vacuum is developed inside of it and allowed for the discovery of cathode rays, or streams of electrons. When the rays hit the walls of the tube, they excited the atoms in the glass, making them fluoresce and give off a yellow-green glow. Later experimenters painted the back wall of the Crookes tube with a fluorescent paint to make the beams more visible. The emblem could certainly be seen in this way. Models of it even have it being wired up to several large Baghdad batteries in series for power. However, it has been demonstrated that duplications of the Baghdad battery only generate about 0.5 to 1 volts in a current of only about 10 milliamps, though its output could be substantially increased with size and materials. Still, the Crookes tube required at least 5,000 volts to operate, an electrical potential far beyond what even a number of Baghdad batteries could produce. However, the power capacity of such batteries might theoretically be enough to enhance bioluminosity. Could we see the oval container instead as being filled with seawater, with a snake figure inside representing life? Life as in the living organisms within which give off light similar to a modern ambient light? And how about an electrical wire connecting it to a source of low-level electricity, such as earth batteries or Baghdad battery precursors? Or perhaps we could even see the cable as a tube instead for the input of a mild acid like lemon juice. Acidity is known to stimulate stronger luminosity in bioluminescent algae. I can also attest to the fact that gentle acoustic vibration can stimulate the organisms to glow, but I have not yet maximized the conditions for bioluminosity of the cultures for a proper demonstration. I may also need to purchase video equipment which operates a little better in low light conditions. But here in a video clip from Pyro Farms, a cultivator and distributor of bioluminescent pyrodino kits, we can see the organisms being stimulated by musical vibrations. Knowing that they can respond to vibrations just as with other types of motion means that the wire could also be an acoustic conductor. This may bring to mind Philadelphian inventor John Worrell Keeley and his gold, silver, and platinum wire, which was said to have conducted the acoustic energy in his experiments, just as a copper wire conducts electricity. We've also seen this concept demonstrated similarly with the toy cup phones that most of us built and played with as children, in which sound is transmitted between two cups over a taut string. Please see my video, Wired for Anti-Gravity, John Worrell Keeley's mysterious gold, silver, and platinum wire, for a more detailed explanation and demonstration of sound transmission over a loose metal wire. But even without electricity and sound, it is not difficult in the least to obtain light from the organisms, as even slight motions can trigger their bioluminescence. We can see here that the dendera is even being held at an angle, perhaps implying angled motion, just as the ambient light, which requires a similar motion in order to glow. The glowing liquid could even be poured out in a type of luminescent libation. Wouldn't such a device, in which the gods seem to manifest as literal living light, and possibly being able to influence the luminosity of that light with electricity or sound, would be both poetic and affirming to temple devotees of the power of the gods, as well as the holiness of the priests, who seemingly wielded that power. It is very reminiscent of the temple machines later used by the ancient Greeks, which were also used to mystify temple adherents and reaffirm the presence of the gods. If nothing else, this is certainly a different interpretation of the dendera light. And it also shows that there are indeed other ways to produce light that are similar to, but not exactly the same as, the modern lighting systems that we're more familiar with. Probably the main caveat is that the Egyptians would have had to import the bioluminescent species and cultivate them to the needed densities since they tend to grow mainly in marine environments as opposed to the freshwater environment of the Nile River. But looking at the work of GLOWE and other green technology innovators, we may well be on the way back to using a similar lighting scheme, if in fact the property of bioluminescence was harnessed during certain points in the ancient world. When considering these possibilities in the distant past, we have to think outside of the box. We have to be very careful about looking for exact duplicates of our own modern technology in ancient civilizations, hence inducing us to dismiss the existence of advanced ancient technology just because we don't recognize it as such. The ancients may have been very aware of many of the same principles as we are, but may have used them in radically different ways and consequently developed radically different technologies. High civilizations will have the opportunity, resources, and motivation to systematically explore and exploit many different principles and properties to an astonishing degree, evolving them from mere curiosities to highly developed and practical principles over time. Thus, we might expect ample use of oil lamps and torches earlier in a civilization's history, gradually giving way to more advanced technology and techniques. Looking back at the aforementioned Egyptian blue, we are reminded that its remarkable infrared luminescence has only recently been discovered in 2009. Produced more than 5,000 years ago, the processing of the pigment was a very skilled, multi-phase process and required exact amounts of its constituent materials. A very detailed technological process. But no written information has been found concerning its manufacture. Yet we know that they did in fact make it, regardless of if they harnessed it for its infrared properties, its cooling properties, or just as a plentiful coloring pigment. We might wonder then what other ancient technological marvels were produced but never codified in writing, or the writing simply lost to time. Perhaps we can imagine lighting up ancient underground chambers and caves with the low-power bioluminescence of cultivated glowworms or fungi, rather than the high-powered fluorescence of industrial lighting. Portable bioelectrical orbs rather than flashlights. Macro circuits instead of microcircuits. Electric eels for electrotherapy instead of high-voltage coils. And even vibrational engines to move heavy loads instead of rotary engines and wheels. So what are the real answers concerning ancient technology? Is it really likely that Egypt and other ancient civilizations could have existed for so long and not have developed a technology on a level rivaling our own, even if it was radically different? And if not, then what has been so different about our modern civilization that we developed to such an advanced degree while they did not? Time in and of itself is not likely the factor, as ancient Egypt in particular lasted for over 3,000 years, while Western civilization is significantly younger, especially if we coincide the birth of the modern West with the Italian Renaissance. Some would claim that the difference is that we've had alien help for the last 70 plus years, beginning with the Roswell crash. But those same claimants would say that ancient Egypt also had that very same alien help. And further, where were the aliens and their technological assistance during the vast intervening time in between the ancient societies and the Roswell event? Why don't we see a level of technology postulated in Atlantis or in more recent times, say during the Middle Ages? There are indeed a few discrepancies even in the ancient alien narrative. It is certainly not a Deus ex machina or solves all issues approach. So it all still begs the question as to how it is believed that we were able to develop more in 300 years than the Egyptians did in 3,000, with or without extra help. It is agreed that the Great Pyramids are 5,000 years old at the very least, perhaps much older. It is also generally agreed that we could duplicate the pyramids and other structures, such as Baalbek today, with modern technology. We might even be able to build them in significantly less time. But one thing that it would not be is easy. Replicating the pyramid's precision, their foundational resilience, and structural longevity, the transportation and handling of the massive blocks, etc., would still be significant technical challenges, even 5,000 plus years later. And so, the question is, why? Why would it still be a challenge if we were supposed to be 5,000 years more advanced and 5,000 years smarter? An average student from today would likely have more general knowledge, at least in certain areas, than a career scientist from the 1600s who didn't know of certain principles such as how mass is related to energy, for instance. It is also unlikely that a scientist from the 1600s would be able to describe the basics of aerodynamics. Again, something that the average educated person could easily spout today. And to think, this represents a general knowledge gap of only 400 years. Hence, it would seem that the same average person today could be described as being much more technologically advanced in certain areas than a scientist from the 17th century. It also follows that the average educated person from today should be much more technologically advanced than a master pyramid builder from the 2nd millennium BC. Yet we know that this is not the case. Even the best modern career engineers would still be challenged by some of the staggering details associated with building the pyramids. From this perspective, we might be able to conclude one of two things. Either that as technologically advanced as we are now, we are still nowhere near as advanced as we should be, or that the Egyptians and other ancient civilizations were much more advanced, perhaps even closer to us than we realize. Occam's razor states that all things being equal, the simplest answer tends to be the correct one. So is it possible that the simplest answer here is that these ancient societies did have a considerably higher level of technology than is currently acknowledged, perhaps rivaling our own in certain areas? But that was not only radically different than that which we are familiar with, it was perhaps also lost and scattered over time, catalyzed by and represented in certain destructive events, such as the Dark Ages in Europe, the sacking of ancient Baghdad, which few realize was once one of the science and technological centers of the world. Not to mention the burnings of books at Alexandria in Egypt and at Mali in West Africa, and other similar events. The destruction of Alexandria alone has been postulated by some to have set humanity back 1,000 years. And so we can imagine the anti-civilization impact of all of these events taken collectively. Ultimately, the questions of advanced ancient technology and innovation invites much in the way of speculation. But the term speculation itself needn't be pejorative. Speculation in a scientific investigation is fine as long as it's stated to be as much. We must remember that speculation leads to hypothesis. Hypothesis leads to theories, and theories can lead to established facts. It is part of the scientific method. It seems that modern science has become somewhat dogmatic as of late, with less tolerance of healthy speculation and imagination. Speculation is often used during criminal case studies and manhunts in order to derive new insights and leads, which are subsequently investigated to determine if they are valid. Science should never become doctrine, which can never be questioned or updated. This brings to mind the words of Einstein, who said that imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress. So what do you think? Did the ancients develop advanced technologies such as artificial lighting, which have so far eluded modern archaeology? Let's start a discussion in the comment section below. This is the first part of an ongoing investigation into the possibilities of ancient lighting. More interesting discussions and experiments with bioluminescence, triboluminescence, and other lighting principles will be forthcoming. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned.